Thank you all for being here. My name is Joy Brand Richardson, and I am the Vice President of Professional Development at JCC Association. I am joined by my colleague, Mark Young, who is going to be assisting and doing some of the announcements as well. We have a couple of things to get started with as we open our session today. This session is called, hold on one second. I'm just flipping through my notes here. We're going to be talking about gender hiring and equity, and we are joined by Sara Shapiro-Plevan. And just in a few minutes, we will hear a little bit more about Sara. To get us started, if this is not the session that you intended to be in, please go back to the Spot Me platform and open a different session so that you can be in the right place. We aspire to have everyone feel that they are comfortable at ProCon. And as so, we have enabled the closed captioning. If you'd like to keep it on, you can. If not, you can click on the button at the bottom of your screen and turn it off. And also, we are recording this session. If you don't want to be recorded, please close out your video, but we would love to be able to see everyone. So if you can, and you're not just calling in on a phone or something, please do keep your video on. That's really important for us to see all of these wonderful 56 different faces. Please reach out to Mark or myself if you have any questions. You can see us at the top of the chat box and in the participants list. We're thrilled to offer this multifaceted conference at no cost to the JCCs, and that is done because we have amazing sponsors and vendors. And you will have an opportunity to visit the vendor hall in their booths tomorrow. And if you have any questions, you can go to the sponsor sheet on Spot Me and take a look at all the different sponsors and click on them and send them a chat, find out more information. Some of them have uploaded videos about their products. Right now, I'd like to introduce Michelle Eisenberg, who is the HR director at the Mandel JCC in Cleveland. Michelle has also been part of our steering committee for this conference. Michelle is here to introduce our presenter for today.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you and pleased to be introducing this session. As part of the planning team for the peer community, we expressed a large interest in learning more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our HR practices and how we can strengthen equity in our community and in our hiring. I'm thrilled to be welcoming Sara Shapiro-Plevan, the co-founder and CEO of the Gender Equity and Hiring Project and founder of the Rimonine Consulting, to ProCon. Sara will soon receive her doctorate in Jewish education from the William Davidson Graduate School of Jewish Education at the Jewish Theology Seminar. Her full bio is located on the conference platform for you to review. We're thrilled she's here to share with us about how we can create better equity in our hiring practices, a priority for all the JCCs, especially now. Sara, I'm turning the floor over to you. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just had the privilege of learning from Mark and Joy and Michelle a little bit about the back end of the JCCA Zoom platform. So I hope you all are able to see it. Mark or Joy, you got a thumbs up? Great, fantastic. Thank goodness for a thumbs up, right? Thank you all. I'm so happy to be with you all today. I am right now in New York in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Indians, just a little bit from the Merrick and the Shinnecock. And thank you for helping me to anchor in that space. It is just an absolute delight to be with all of you. Our work today is really meant to focus on gender equity in the hiring process. And this session really is at the sweet spot of our work, really to think about how we think about hiring, both to lift up women, but also to lift up people of all genders into leadership, and to think very carefully about what it might mean to incorporate an equity lens into our hiring and our employment processes. So really, we're here today to think about equity just as a natural part of our hiring and employment processes where it has not necessarily been present before, or perhaps where it has been present through your individual work and not necessarily through an organizational lens. I want to invite you to do two things when we're together. If it is your desire as a learner to just sit back and relax and enjoy the session, please do. or to take notes. I will be sharing this slideshow, the deck, with our team, with Mark and Joy, so that they can share it with you. And if you are the kind of person who likes to take notes, feel free, but do know that you can sit back and relax and enjoy. But I also want to encourage you to create a community of learners together here today and to use the chat. This is the space for the side conversations we wish we were having in person. So it is not distracting. Please feel free to use it for conversation dialogue that we might have face to face. It totally amplifies what we do when we're together here. So consider it a learning tool. Use it to discuss, have conversations with each other, share resources, wonder, ask questions, make jokes, whatever. Get the chance to know one another in this space. So with that, we'll just go ahead and dive right in. You chose to be here today for a particular reason, and I want to honor that reason. I want to simply acknowledge that this is going to be a hard conversation. As folks who work in the HR space or who care about the work of HR, you're already deeply invested in this work in some way. And at the same time, we're here to really do the work of releasing our own personal biases and probably as well to release some of the preconceptions that we have about equity, about hiring, about our work in general, about employment overall, and to do that using a growth mindset. So I want to invite you into this space, taking note and reflecting on any discomfort we may have about this conversation. You might be here for a very specific reason. I don't know, you might be here because you might be engaged in a number of or one individual hiring process. You might want to hire a great candidate. You might be responsible inside your JCC for hiring and employment. You might be here because you're seeking gender diversity or any kind of diversity in your organization, in your personal life. You also might be here to make sure that your JCC gets the most bang for their buck in the hiring process or in employment in general. You also could potentially be here because you have seen, for example, the tough underbelly of the Jewish community, and it might not have reflected your best values. You might also be here because you have some aspirations to make some change. Entirely possible. I personally am here because as a child, I was a day camper and early childhood student at the Leo Yasinoff Jewish Center in Columbus, Ohio. I didn't really like being lined up boy, girl, boy, girl. I didn't like that boys got to be the captain of the teams because they raised their hands first. I would have really preferred to be lined up by like sneaker color or alphabetical order or birthday. I wanted a fair chance at being a team captain. We're all coming into this conversation for many, many different reasons. You might be here in joy, you might be here in anger. You might actually be here because diversity, equity, inclusion, respectful workplaces are your values. So I just want to name that all of these are great reasons, and everyone comes with their own reason. Everyone's reason for being in this conversation is valid. So just honor the fact that we believe that gender equity is important. And we have evidence that equity in the workplace is not just good for women or for underserved populations, but it's actually good for business, right? It's good for our JCCs. It's good for our organizations. And we want to also, just before we dive in, acknowledge that this may force us to confront some loss, right? When we're thinking about the hiring process, it may mean that our favorite candidate doesn't get chosen. May mean that some of our values are questioned, might mean that we have to spend more money, our budget priorities might be shifted. And I just want to be open to this idea of loss. When we step into this growth mindset, we end up questioning, we end up pushing ourselves, and we end up then encouraging other folks to grow and change at the same time. So as we step into that, I just want to invite you into that space and recognize that there are some challenges and some opportunities for complication as we move into that space. I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide. Let's see if I'm actually able to do that. There we go. Marvelous. Thanks for your patience. So data. In the spirit of this work, we actually use a lot of data. mostly to approach our work by asking questions. So we believe in the power of data, but actually in our work, data is in really short supply. I have to be completely honest with you. The Jewish community is not fantastic at collecting data in the domain of gender equity and frankly, in the domain of hiring and employment. Luckily, I had the great opportunity to read some data that was shared about the work of the JCC. The JCCA's salary and benefits survey from 2017, which I'll reflect on in just a minute. We have some fantastic research done by Leading Edge, and I had a chance to learn with Amy Bourne the other day. We love relying on data because ultimately, data doesn't lie. Data tells a story, and of course, there are multiple ways to interpret that. But we need as much data as we possibly can in order to learn from it, in order to have evidence to reflect on and to move forward. I bring this to you specifically because we need data, and we'll incorporate some data into our conversation today, but at the same time, I want to honor that data often sits along a binary. And in our world, actually, data in this domain often speaks about men and women, represents a real bias in our language, a real bias in this work overall. And the language that you will hear really reflects that binary. So I just want to acknowledge that binary. And I want to invite you to understand that when we speak about data that incorporates men and women, we at the Gender Equity and Hiring Project really want to embrace that as male identifying people and female identifying people, recognizing that so often data about people who are non-binary and trans often are not represented in data collections. So we want to embrace a broad perspective on this data and invite multiple interpretations, recognizing that often the data does not necessarily voice the perspectives of that broad sort of imagining of community. So again, just reflecting that our work, the Gender Equity and Hiring Project, is meant to lift up women, but really to think about it really as a rising tide that lifts all ships, because supporting equitable hiring for people of all genders is really the best way to do this work as we approach equity on the road to equality for people of all genders. So I'm going to take just a moment to reflect on the salary study from 2017 that the JCCA conducted. This was really just an incredible moment for me to take a look at some data straight from your world and to really think very concretely about some of the stories that it might actually tell us. So all of this was done, I assume in 2017 or in 2016 and shared in 2017, reflecting salaries and benefits of over 4,000 JCC employees in 79 GCCs and 6 individual camps. A lot of people. So really just a fantastic slice of the perspective of what it looks like to work in the JCC world. Of course, I just want to, before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that that was 2017. We're in 2021, in an entirely different world. The world has really changed. And it's not just that the pandemic changed us, obviously, but the world really has changed so much in 4 years, and we don't know exactly what that change looks like. So I want to reflect on it nonetheless. This is the data that we have. And I think it's important just to reflect on what some of those changes might be when we do take a look at the data. So I'm going to share with you some of this and just some data at first on the gender wage gap. Really, for some context, among all positions, right, positions across the board, from entry-level positions to executives, women are paid on average 93% of what men are paid. And this is up from 2014, right? That is by and large better than the American pay gap of 82%, right? 82 cents on the dollar. And it actually, for all positions is fairly good. And if you notice, it actually gets worse as we approach executive level. The gap actually gets more significant toward 78%, and that is a drop. You note as well that men's starting salaries rose by 22%, right? Rose by 22%. Interestingly, right, this represents, right, JCCs of all sizes and in all geographical areas. That wage gap, right, of starting salaries larger than their female counterparts, is not across the board, but could be as much as 22%. I don't want to say that this isn't great news, right? So I'll summarize. Women are making more than they were before, right? But that's not necessarily in top tier C-suite positions. And by and large, it looks to be in jobs that are paying less money. They're not in leadership positions. And we want to take a look at what those actual positions are, where those leadership roles actually are. So for example, right, we want to take a look at what the actual gender gap is looking like inside some of these JCCs. In senior management, and in the report, I noticed a really interesting detail. There was a sort of a missing 271 folks who didn't have a title, couldn't be categorized, whose work wasn't important enough to count in the conversation. 6.6% of people measured didn't have titles. In senior management positions, 64% are held by women. This is down from 214. And at executives, right, only 29% are women, down 10% from 2014, right? That's a huge drop. And the report actually explains this away with an excuse. This is due to the fact, and this is a quote straight from the text, that more men started in executive positions during the last 3 years. Okay, so we hear that. This is good news and bad news. In the for-profit world, in the not-for-profit world, and in the rest of the Jewish community, these numbers are pretty much the same. So the GCC world is actually no different than the rest of the Jewish community, than the not-for-profit world and the for-profit world. In every category, only about a third of senior leadership identifies as female. The workforce is female, but leadership is not. So we're not alone. The Jewish community is not alone. JCCs are not alone. And it is our problem, but it's not our problem alone, right? The good news is we can look to other examples for resources and inspiration to solve the challenge. And as the Jewish source says, Lo bashamayim hi, the solution is not in heaven, it's right here on the ground. We actually have the resources to work with this issue. Right here on the ground, we actually see where our people are, right? They're working in positions that actually make it challenging to imagine leadership right away. We have to note that challenge in the roles that people are playing, right? So take a look at the bottom, you see the gender gap overall, pink collar work, blue collar work, and white collar work. Women make up a majority in JCCs of associate and executives and program directors. Obviously more representative in human resource departments. Hello, everybody. Membership departments, marketing, arts and culture, definitely more represented in early childhood centers, in teachers and staff. Men are a majority of executives in sports facilities, securities, facilities, IT directors, et cetera. We don't know how this actually will change as a result of the pandemic. And I don't have data about the JCC colleagues who were laid off. We know that the vast majority of them were not in the C-suite, but we also know that the first folks in so many of your communities to come back to work were actually the early childhood directors and teachers who were there to serve young families. And we hope that there's an emerging opportunity for balance there. And I think it's really an exciting opportunity to imagine where some of that gender balance and opportunity might be. So we want to just think for a moment about really what this is all about. This data does not actually live in a vacuum. It's in your office places. You are surrounded by this every day, whether you are working at home on Zoom or you actually have gone back to work. We know that gender bias exists. Let's name it. We know that more and more women, and actually many more men, are willing to speak up when they note bias, when they see something that appears to be biased, and to step into the role of serving as an ally for others. They're more ready to disrupt systems and to bring an equity lens to their work so that women and people of every underrepresented community can actually rise. So the question really that we're facing is what this is all about. So we ask really this question about gender bias. All of this for us, questions about executives, questions about how folks are promoted, questions about the gender wage gap, for us is all linked to gender bias. Somewhere, somehow, we want to see gender bias in some way, and biases, cognitive and implicit biases writ large, as in some way a root cause here. But let's really quickly define what gender bias is. Specifically with regard to hiring and employment, we define it in legal terms. Unequal treatment in employment opportunity, such as promotion, pay, benefits, privileges, expectations, often due to attitudes based on the sex of an employee or a group of employees, right? Straight from legal terminology. However, it's not actually just employment, right? It's also about unequal treatment. And in this is a significant implicit bias. Any one of these can really be sort of a variety of stereotypical beliefs about individuals, right? Employing are stereotypes, just on the basis of sex, often as particular as related to differential treatment between the sexes. Our minds behave differently, right? And then that causes us to behave differently and treat people differently. We just want to recognize and honor the fact that human beings are biased, and gender bias exists everywhere. This is not a JCC issue. This is not just a Jewish communal issue. It exists in all spaces, right? For example, it exists in research, medical research, great example, prioritizing like the study of male responses to medication, sometimes even vaccines. Technology, gender bias shows up in the study of artificial intelligence that preferences male facial reactions to artificial intelligence, or even in education, for example, student responses, you heard my example, preferencing male students who raise their hands. You also hold gender biases. A lot of people think that men are better negotiators. Not true. They have more experience, but not necessarily that they're better. Women want to be parents. Men are inclined to want to work. This is a great piece of data grounded in Harvard's implicit association test from their Project Implicit. And the question really for us is how to interrupt this, how to think about mitigating this so that we can move past it. So here's something that I want to share with you that very likely may come up in your work as hiring managers, as folks who are engaged in the hiring process, or in some way interacting with employment in some way or another. A big bias that we hold that interferes with employment, with hiring, is this one. Men are judged on their potential, women are judged on their experience. So I want to invite you to just pause for a moment. Think about it. Men are judged on their potential, women are judged on their experience. Does this sound familiar? So you might think about a time, perhaps, when this has been you, when you've actually engaged this bias, perhaps without even knowing it. Or when you have actually been receiving of this bias. So this is data that's been gathered from McKinsey for the last number of years, British Psychological Survey, documented in the work of Amy Cuddy, Katie Kay, Tara Moore, lots of fantastic researchers. But really, we want to know how this works in real life. So men are often reviewed on their potential performance and capacity for growth, right? It looks into the future. It imagines what's possible, right? Potential. What could a man do in this role? What might he be able to do in this work? Women are actually often reviewed on their current actual performance or their experience. It's a retrospective. What has she accomplished? Right? What did she do in her previous role that helps us to understand what she might be capable of doing in this one? So I want you to hold on to this. It's deeply influenced us. It's deeply influenced researchers around the globe who are concerned about gender equity. And you actually may be thinking about it when you contemplate this in your own work. I also want to just think about how this actually interacts with our assessments, our performance evaluations, how we not just engage in hiring, but how we measure work, and how we value our employees as well. So imagine comparing resumes, for example, or sitting in an interview. Imagine the questions that you might like to ask a candidate, or even in a performance review. It's relevant as a bias in each one of these situations. So it ends up causing us to oversimplify or even generalize. And we want to think about changing that orientation, pushing ourselves to release that bias and getting other folks to recognize it as well. So we want to invite ourselves really to release that bias so that we can treat people completely equitably without the burden of contemplating potential when we should all be sharing our experience. So I want to give you a chance to practice. Let's just take a moment and practice. So I want to introduce you to Emma Bernstein. And I want to give you a chance just to take a look at her resume. And in the chat, I would love to give you a chance to just share your reactions. What do you know about her? So Emma Bernstein is applying for a position as the assistant director of your JCC's day camp. Just take a quick moment in the chat, share your reactions. Just throw up your immediate reactions into the chat. What do you want to know about her? What are your reactions to her resume? Just take a moment. What do you notice? Any thoughts? Right, so does she work well with children? Tell me what you notice specifically about her resume. She's very educated, that is true. Right? We don't really notice anything about, there's nothing here that really speaks to whether or not she has managerial experience. Right? She has leadership roles, but nothing that speaks to her work with young people, right? She has experience with teens, but not necessarily with young people. Her resume looks like a job description. Interesting. She has no camp experience. There's a gap in her work between college and her other work, right? No functions, no accomplishments. Pour it in, share some more. Right? It's a big jump from a library assistant to a senior advisor. It is a youth group advisor, but still, right? She has worked with teens, so she might be able to work with day campers. Is it bad that you want to sit with her and help her redo her resume? No, not at all. That's great, fantastic. I'll put you in touch. What else do you notice about her? No skills listed, right? What do you know about her? So a couple of things that often come up, right? There's not a lot here, right? You know that she's connected to Jewish life. So a couple of things that you might be able to unpack, right? You see that she has no address. No address that's posted. Often folks will post an address on a resume. She does not post an address. She only posts an email account. She's someone in transition. I can tell you a little bit about her. You are able to determine how old she is, more or less, based on this. She graduated from college in 2016 and graduated from high school in 2012. Right, it's getting very common not to put addresses on resumes. That's right. Both for socioeconomic sort of reasons, but also because it's unnecessary. But you might be able to learn a little bit about her knowing what the prefix is on her phone number. That is a New York area cell phone number, for those of you who don't know. Little experience, right? Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? You know her name, which might tell you a little bit about her. You know her age. You know a little bit about sort of perhaps her sort of station in life. You know her extracurriculars. You can immediately identify that she is Gen Z, right? You can in some way assume a gender preference, right? But she could be non-binary or transgender, absolutely. She seems kind of smart, graduated cum laude, right? All of these are things that enact and engage your automatic perception bias. I want to introduce you to that term if you're not familiar with it. That is the reflexive reaction to a particular person or object. You had an immediate reaction to who this person was. She might not have been a good match. She didn't have supervisory skills. You made an immediate assumption without ever having met her. You made a certain assessment of her qualifications for the task, for the work that she potentially was applying for, simply based on her resume. Could have been based on the style of the resume, perhaps a little creative, the sans serif font, her age. I noticed none of you commented on her extracurricular badass. This is a real thing, the Brandeis Academic Debate and Speech Society, right? We have engaged a certain set of reflexive reactions, in this case, automatic perception bias. When we take a look at someone's resume for the first time, we make certain judgments about them. And these are biases that show up in our hiring process. Important just to acknowledge them, to pause and reflect on where bias might actually be showing up in our work. So I want to note for you just a couple of places and a couple of details around where gender bias might actually show up in the hiring process, where it might actually have some implications in your employment processes from start to finish. So to begin with, right, you may actually, let me go back. You may actually have the benefit of engaging hiring committees in your work, especially for more prominent positions, not necessarily for assistant positions for your day camp. But, right, you want to actually begin by thinking about the role of your hiring committee. So hiring committee is often not actually designed with equity in mind. So from their constitution actually to the ways in which they do business, they're often not gender balanced. And they often don't represent the diversity of the community they represent, or even how they're structured in a way that represents a healthy process or fairness or even equity. They often represent power, donor privilege, and they're really an important, really a vital spot for contemplating how human nature interacts with bias. So what do the people involved in a hiring process bring to the table? Who's on the committee? How do they really reflect your JCC's mission and vision, their constituency, and the organization's future? Is the committee itself gender balanced? Is it age balanced? Is it racially and socioeconomically balanced? You want to start with all of these. Then from the committee, you really would like to probably move on to a job description. Job descriptions themselves are often just used as advertisements, but they're really an important focus of our work with the Gender Equity and Hiring Project. We look at these as text, almost as like a really rich Jewish text. They're an important focus of our work because they have within them embedded assumptions about our future employees. Look at the language. How do we write these job descriptions? What do they say about our values, about the people that we want to hire, about experience versus potential? We want to think about the way that we change the way that we write these documents. We often use old ones and just recycle them because, you know, the job is going to kind of be the same more or less. We want to actually think about using templates or creating new material that reduces the chance to rely on undocumentable content and accessible experience to give everybody a chance to actually eliminate the fluff and make sure job descriptions are actually measurable and accurate and engage as few of the sort of natural biases that we hold as possible. Then when we actually are at the point where we begin to collect resumes like Emma Bernstein's, we want to think about actually being a part of this process with a different mindset. We want to design this process differently. So for example, what if we actually blinded our resumes? We took off beforehand their names and ages. What if we interviewed people even before looking at their resumes? So for example, looking at their experience or looking at their education. What if we actually designed a totally different calling card, right? Maybe something more like a CV and less like a resume or something completely different. Bias is actually engaged in all parts of the resume process. And there's some really concrete tactics that we can use to ameliorate the reading of resume process, both as employers and frankly for prospective employees. So if we reduce our dependence on these automatic biases, like our review of Emma Bernstein's, we can evaluate these potential employees based on their own potential and their experience altogether.
Yeah, I'm listening in. Yeah, what's going on?
I'll make sure that
Yeah.
person's
Oh, wait,
Keep
hold on.
going. If you can just unmute if you're not muted, and I'll make sure you're muted. Sarah, continue.
Great, thanks. Recruiting. So recruiting, I think, is often difficult, and we often find that we are in a position to have a dearth of employees, prospective employees, when we open up positions. This is hard. I hope that in the coming year, when you open up positions, you find a wealth of folks to fill your open positions. And where equity interacts with this process is really about our network. We want to bring equity into the recruiting conversation by expanding the notion of network. Where do we actually have the capacity to go beyond our network? Not just the people that we know who may look like us, who may be the same gender, the same socioeconomic class, the same race as we are, and really to look at real diversity in our talent pools. Do we know who's missing? We often don't. We actually have to invite ourselves to look and to inquire into who is missing. We bring a lot of assumptions about the process that's limited by the scope of our own networks, often our friend networks, and how we can hire for the job, not based on our connections or what we assume the position should be. We also want to hire the best candidate, not the candidate we think is best, but the best candidate. This is often about the data that can be freed from bias, or at least that bias can be acknowledged in the process. And then, of course, we haven't even gotten to interviews. Interviews often, in so many instances, and I'm sure that many of you have been a part of this, are giant. They're terrifying. They can be one person in front of a committee of all of the wrong people or the wrong mix of people. Very likely many of us have been in interviews that have looked like this. We understand that there are ways to make these better. Again, collecting data in the interview process is vital. Shrinking down the process is also vital. clarifying the steps of the process to make sure that we treat candidates ethically, respectfully, and humanizing the process. Caring for candidates along that journey is really vital as we move toward a hire, so that we don't show our hand and we don't take advantage of folks emotionally and ethically along that journey. And finally, something that I think that we don't actually typically incorporate, but that really is an approach to equity through this entire process, is something that can work its way into the entire set of sort of the entire lens of this work is questions. Do we ask uniform questions within our committee work or about our job descriptions and resumes in the recruiting process or in the interview process? Do we ask uniform questions that enable us to call the same data, to get the same data about everyone and about everything? The questions that we ask need to be clear. They need to be divergent questions, open-ended questions that engage people in storytelling, and above all, need to be legal. They're often not. We need to ask questions that enable us to park our biases at the door and get to know candidates for what they bring to the table, about their work, and about nothing else. Questions can actually help committees function well. They can help us to review and write job descriptions well, and do so much more grounded in our own curiosity and inquiry, and make sure that along the way, we're also collecting data really beautifully. So with this, it's just an opportunity in every way to release bias by slowing down, engaging our inquiry muscles, and just striving to reflect on bias and how we actually can be different in the process. I want to end with this notion of bias mitigation. The work of engaging our thinking about bias is not actually asking you to give up your biases entirely, right? You can't, you're human. Biases are the ways that our brains work. Sometimes they protect us, sometimes they're harmful, but we have to actually recognize that we can do something about them and work to mitigate them, to work our ways around them. We can start from a place of working on this generally about all of us, and then move to specific behaviors in ourselves and with others. When we are working to engage mitigation in our own bias and reach for really equity in hiring, we often want to just sit back and recognize that we are biased, right? Bias affects our work, and it is a fact. Neither good nor bad, but we just want to recognize that bias exists in our work. That's an important general first step. Implicit bias is normal. It is normal. We are all biased. It's not okay, but it's normal. And at the same time, we can be really specific when we do this work, right? We can observe our stereotypes. We can observe our biases, and then we can make decisions consciously and reflectively. We can give feedback. We can ask questions. We can build in data. We can collect data, ask healthy questions, give and receive feedback to each other, right? And then we can take individual accountability in this process by really developing a capacity to shine a light on our work, invite other people to be a part of transparency and responsibility by inviting them into dialogue, being self-critical, which is hard, inviting people to reflect with us on our own processes, and inviting people to join with us in what I like to call productive discomfort, right? What about this is hard? What about this is new? And inviting people to explore that with us. So with this, I want to end by inviting you simply to pause for a moment. And as folks who do HR work, in whatever domain you serve, whether it's specifically in the HR function or in employment and the hiring in so many different domains inside JCCs, I want to invite you to think about where bias shows up in your work, right? Where this affects you where you may be engaged in biased practices yourself, because we are human. And in order to get this, we actually have to pause and think about how it works for each of us. And simply to confront your biases. And when you leave here today, I just want to invite you to pause and reflect on this. This is a challenge, and it's a practical invitation. This is not an implicit bias training. This is an invitation to confront where in these hiring and employment processes you find yourself encountering bias on the route to equity. I want to reflect just for a moment that the work of the Gender Equity and Hiring Project is really about supporting folks like you who are embedded inside Jewish organizations doing this work, who are confronting these questions every day. And if that's something that you're interested in exploring more, I would love to explore these challenges with you individually, and really to think about how we actually can change on the ground our individual responses to these questions and issues as they emerge in your work. So with that, Mark, Joy, I would love to open it up for some questions.
Sara, thank you so much. I'm going to remove your spotlight. If you want to unshare your screen, we'll all see each other. I might add my spotlight and have just the two of us, or Joy as well. A few questions came in. First of all, thank you so much. Sara, just want to unshare your screen so we can all see each other? Excellent. Excellent. And I'll you can put it into that gallery view for yourself if you wish. We can all see each other. I think that might be nice. Let me just add, thank you so much on behalf of Joy and myself and JCC Association. We've both known you for a very long time. Sara and I were colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary for 8 or 9 years, or at least I was there when you were there for 8 or 9 years. And I've just loved learning with you. And I'm so glad that's continuing. A lot of questions have come in, so let's get right to it. This is the most recent one that come in. I will go back in the chat as well, I promise. What recommendations do you have for sourcing a more diverse candidate pool, expanding on what you've already talked about in terms of bias mitigation?
Absolutely. So you heard me speak about network, and this is a particular challenge, I think, that so many of us are really confronting right now. We have a tendency to send out, job posts, job descriptions to the same places that we always do, right? To the job boards and to our locals. And some of us use, I don't know, Jewish jobs and Jewish staffing and some of the Jewish sources. Some of us use some of the non-Jewish job boards. The fact is that we actually, if we want to look for diversity, if we want to approach this from an equity perspective, we actually may have to go beyond, right? We may have to actually start to look at places that may give us access to an entirely different pool of candidates. I want to give an example. There is this is from outside the JCC world, a Jewish after-school program in the greater Philadelphia area that really was, hoping to find a more diverse candidate pool for a director position in a satellite program. They kept getting the same 25-year-old white woman candidate. They wanted to diversify. They were looking to find a more diverse pool. You have to figure out where those other people are and go after them. In many instances, we do not actually use our alumni networks. We do not use our university connections. We do not go to our community's alumni networks. And we do not use our local university connections that may allow us to tap, for example, those networks that will help us to reach a more diverse candidate pool. That's one place to start. And I want to encourage you to go to the places where those candidates might be instead of expecting that they will find you.
Sarah, thank you. And for those of us that were with us yesterday, one of our panelists, I believe it was Jeff Luttrell, talked about creating new partnerships with your JCC that link you to those candidates that you might not otherwise attract. So you connected those dots, Sarah. Thank you. I find this question fascinating, especially as someone who did a lot of interviewing when I worked in HR at a JCC. How do you feel about giving interviewees the questions prior to an interview in order for them to be better prepared? Sort of like an open book test.
I love that question, and I saw it come up, and I'm so grateful for it. We have long assumed that interviews are like tests, right? And that the interview itself is an opportunity to surprise someone and to see how they operate under pressure. It's not clear to me why that's the case. We would like to see candidates in interviews operate at their very best. We would like to see them at their very best. We would like to hear their most thoughtful responses, and we would like to hear their most honest answers. I think that the opportunity to hear a cogently prepared response is hands down preferable to the surprise question. We have so many barriers to engaging people's really deep thinking in interviews. And we want to make sure that what we are seeing is the person's depth of thinking that we will see on the job. By and large, we do, on the job have to bring our rapid thinking, but not in the kind of surprise way that they have to bring to job interviews. And I think it's a wonderful idea to help people prepare with those kinds of advanced questions.
That I think it might be something that many of us might experiment with, or if we're maybe already doing that to a degree, how we might be amplifying. I want to say some of the suggestions that you mentioned, Sarah, early in your presentation, many of our HR folks on this call and not on this call may already be doing or experimenting with, and I think you're validating it.
And by the way, if folks are already engaged in this, then please feel free to share how it's working. By the way, many of these are recommendations that come from the for-profit world. As folks are reaching toward equity, these are not, not necessarily things that I come up with on my own, but so much of this is work that we are noticing that takes place in the for-profit sector and that the Jewish community really has not yet reached for. And by the way, I just want to note, as mentioned in the chat, that all of this helps us to create a uniform, consistent experience so that we can measure one candidate and compare them to the next, so that we're not engaging our own implicit biases when we look at candidates, but that we can compare the data one candidate to the next, which is often something that we do not do. Helping us, by the way, giving questions in advance and making sure that those questions are consistent, that enables us to collect one uniform set of data about a variety of different candidates and compare those candidates uniformly to each other, which again is a really powerful reach toward equity.
So we have about 5 more minutes or so with Sarah. So keep submitting your questions. I have, I think, at least 2 that I could ask. And what I'm going to ask right now, how might we teach this to our department heads who do the sum of the hiring? And I was going to add, how also do we teach this to our C-suite and our executives or the executive? It's not always easy to do that. Any tips and tools there?
Absolutely. So I want to just invite you to ask first the question about our biased brain, right? Where might bias be entering into this process? Any process, right? For all of us are, we're process people, right? When you are engaged in any kind of work, begin by asking yourself where your biases might be interrupting this process. And I always really like to model that for other people. Begin with that question and invite them into that dialogue. That may actually already intersect with work that you have done around implicit bias training or other diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you are doing inside your institution. And it may evoke certain sort of broader communal issues as well, but it invites people to reflect personally on larger issues and bring their own stories to the table. I also want to invite you to begin, and this is wonderful for working with senior level staff, mid-level staff, staff at every single level, to invite the question, who is missing? Right? Who is missing? When you have a pile of resumes in front of you and you spread them out and you are looking at them, ask yourself, in this pool of candidates, who's missing? Right? When you constitute a committee that is beginning to search for an executive, you look at that committee and that list of names, simply ask yourself, ask the folks that you're working with, invite them to contemplate the question, who's missing? Those are two different orientations to this work that you can immediately bring to your teams. It will help you to anchor all of this in a bias orientation to lift away that bias and reach toward equity. Two simple questions that really should begin to enable you to teach other folks and to model for other folks what this striving for equity looks like.
So Sarah, I have one more question. There might be someone that just came in, but I'll look at that as well. But at least one more question. You talked about having a different calling card other than a resume. What could that calling card be? I think you're showing the biases of a resume, but it is also helpful to get some kind of sense of who all the candidates are. We can't interview everybody. So what's an alternative that might be less biased infused?
I am really fascinated by the work of the arts world around portfolios. Often that is incorporated in education spaces as well. And what it might mean for folks to not actually have a running record of where they've worked and the lovely statements about what they've done in those workplaces, but instead to submit or to share a portfolio of their work. In some instances, perhaps some of the things that they've written, some of the materials that they have created in collaboration with other folks. This works better for some roles than other roles, but for people to present and even to submit some of those portfolios of work, we know that this is extraordinary in education settings and in the arts domain. And what it really might look like to shift away from that reliance on sort of a formal running record of someone's experience and shift instead to artifacts.
So I'm going to ask one more question. This comes from Angela H. Angela, you feel free to, do you want to just read it or say what your question is? Because I can read what you put, but I'd love it for you.
Yeah. No. So I just started here at the JCC, and I'm in San Diego, and I'm not Jewish. And the CEO, I come from a for-profit. I used to work for Target and Titleist. The CEO brought me in partially because she wants to create a more diverse, inclusive work environment here. When I tell everybody that I'm working here, everybody literally the very next statement is, "But you're not Jewish." And even before I started here, I guess I even assumed, I wouldn't apply because I'm not Jewish. And then I had friends who were Jewish who were like, "No, go apply." We're trying to figure out how do we get the message out? Because when we do post, even if we're posting in other areas to try to bring in a more inclusive, diverse applicant pool, people still aren't applying because I think they also think, well, I'm not Jewish, so I'm not going to apply. And we include the typical, diversity statement at the bottom, but
Right.
We're trying to come up with ways to really get that message out there in the postings that we want everyone to apply. And I don't know if anybody has found a good way to tackle that, because our applicant pool is so small, because I think people feel like, well, we're not Jewish, we're not going to apply. So we tend to get the same type of applicants. And that's our challenge.
So this is, I think, a fantastic last question to end on. I think part of it is about how your JCC shows up in the world and whether they see diversity in the images that are shared of a particular community. If they see only, images on a website that look like all people of the same kind, Ashken normative, white, affluent Jews, then they're not going to think of it as a place where they could work. If they look instead at a diverse, ethnically, racially, socioeconomically diverse community of people who are the middle C in JCC, right? The community that is that center, they may be able to see themselves there. And frankly, I think the Jewish Community Center could do more community and more center and do the Jewish too, but embrace that community perspective. I think that, because the Jewish shows up first, that's complicated. But I think we also need to do a better job of recognizing that, I'm going to get the number wrong, but 15 to 20% of our Jewish community it is more diverse than your white Ashkenormative Jewish person, right?
Yeah.
People of color in our community make up a large chunk of our population, and we need to make sure that they are centered in our communities so that when other folks come in, they see people who look like them, who maybe not the same religion, but part of their communities, and that they are aware that we are all one community gathered in one particular community space, and that it is not about religion, that it is about community. I really appreciate also the reference to partnering with other local communities. When the JCC stands alone, the JCC stands alone. When the JCC partners with synagogues, they're creating a very clear message that the J is the priority. When they partner with other community institutions, right, they recognize that C, community, is really what's most important. And I just want to appreciate that in every community, we are really in need of reaching out to folks who are not us, right? We need to know our neighbors. We need to be intimately connected to each other and to break down as many barriers as we possibly can between people so that we can be in intimate relationship with people who are different from us so that we can all sort of understand each other and appreciate each other more. That's my speech. I will live and die on that hill.
Yeah.
But the JCC is really, I think, in so many ways poised to be the first place where that can take place in the Jewish community because of the already diverse nature of JCCs and the opportunity to be that open door space to welcome in people of all kinds.
Sara, thank you. First of all, I want to say no one go anywhere because we do have more programming for the next 25 minutes. Two, Sara, thank you so much. I think you've showed us ways to raise the J and the C in our JCCs. And she is, you'll find her information on Spot Me. We're going to have her PDF of her PowerPoint up on Spot Me. She's available, Gender Equity and Hiring Project. Sara, thank you so much. You're welcome to stay until 2, or you're welcome to sign off.
Thank you, everybody. It was a delight to be with you.
So for some of us, you've joined us today. For some of us, we've been together for 1, 2, or 3 sessions. Joy and I want to take this opportunity to have a group discussion as a JCC HR professionals amongst the biggest gathering of JCC HR professionals as well. We had an energizer plan because we wanted to get you guys standing up and going. We also want to make the most of your time. So as we continue, if you need to stand up and stretch, we encourage you to do so. I'm a former JCC camp song leader, so I have no problem looking silly on camera. You can do as much as you like or not like, but if you stretch around and move around, that is welcome. So I'm actually going to take a risk and do a little technology here, and I'm going to share my screen, and I'm actually going to ask you to grab your phone if it's by you, or you can open up a separate browser on your screen. We're going to do something called a Menti or a Mentimeter. So this is what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go either on your phone, the browser in your phone, or to a different browser if you don't have another computer or a phone with you, and go to menti.com. When you go to menti.com, it'll ask you for a code, and that code is on your screen. So it's 5900-2421. Joy, maybe you can put that in the chat just so it's there, just in case people prefer it. And when you go on your phone or on your other browser, you'll see HR Peer Community ProCon 2021. What we want to do is ask you a series of questions, and then we're going to open it up for group discussion, but we want to capture these questions in a way that we can utilize them. So I'm going to advance my slide. It should advance your screen too, and then you'll have an opportunity to answer the questions that we have. So here we go. Let's see if this works. Okay, so the first question is, how are you feeling right now after our 1, 2, or 3 sessions together? Now, you've probably and maybe been to other sessions at ProCon already, and we'll be going to more. But if you've been to our session before the conference, our peer community yesterday, and or this session, think about all that you've learned. How are you feeling? And just put it in. This is a word cloud, and it gets a sense of how we're all feeling. So energized, thought-provoked, interested. You can put up to 3. I think you can submit multiple times. Amazing. Tired, enlightened, refreshed, excellent. Not bored. That's awesome. Interested, together, wonderful. I'm going to give you a few more seconds. I see 42 people have responded out of 66. So I'm going to give it just another 15 to 30 seconds for you to answer this question. Excellent. If you're having any technical difficulties, email Joy or put us in the chat, but it seems like everyone's doing okay. And if you're at all confused, you can just put your answer in the chat too. We'll capture it there. Excellent. Okay, so we see connected, and that's just so wonderful, and interested and informed, overwhelmed, hopeful, curious, excited, amongst many others. So it's great first to get a sense of how you're feeling after these sessions. This is really great data. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So if you didn't have a chance to put it in, hopefully you did in the last second or two. Amazing. Well, this is all going to be saved, and we can share it with each other later. So next slide. All right, what have we learned? So you can put an answer of what's one thing that you have learned over these 3 sessions that you're taking with you. You have up to 250 characters. So it can be a phrase, it could be a sentence. When the answers come in, they'll come by pretty quick. So I'll try to answer as much as I can, but they'll all be captured. Well, what have we, so being conscious of our own bias, recognize my bias, excellent. Take a hard look at bias, providing interview questions before the interview, focus on the C, risk management, men by potential, women by experience. I'll start scrolling down. Confront your biases. Be on the side of the candidate, then let them show their best self. Connection to others doing this work is important. The importance of inclusion. Forgive me if I'm not reading out yours, but we'll all capture it and you'll all see it. We're all in the same boat, asking myself what other biases are. Obviously, most of these are based on today because it's fresh in our mind. But I see some of these reflect on our session from yesterday or even last week as well. Be more mindful. We're really in this together. Need to look closely at our current practice. Inclusion and recognize biases, focus on the C. Excellent, excellent, excellent. About 41 of almost 70 have responded, 42. So I'm going to give you just another minute. And if for some reason you had a good thought and you didn't put it in before I go to the next slide, throw it in the chat. We'll save it there too. Excellent. Diverse recruiting, connecting with other HR pros, data tells a story. Wonderful. When recording an interview, think of potential legal issues, remembering from yesterday, equity is good business, review salaries. Excellent. When the JCC stands alone, the JCC stands alone. Implicit bias is everywhere and everyone. Thank you. Okay, we're going to talk about this too in a minute. So I'm going to move on to the next question. There's a couple more. What else do we need to know to build on our learning? Is there something now based on these 1 or 2 or 3 sessions you're like, well, now that I know this, I want to know that. So we'll give us a couple of seconds to answer or to think about it and then to answer. And this will be really helpful because though ProCon ends tomorrow, we really want, Joy and I and everyone at JCC Association wants the power of this HR community to continue in a meaningful way. Have an open mind in all areas. Yeah, what else do we need to know? Build practices that other JCCs are using. You never stop learning, how to spread this knowledge in an effective way, how to implement strategies. Continue to ask questions and search for answers. This is great. Methods for training non-HR staff on best practices. More practical specifics. Okay, great. Share ideas that work or don't work with other HR JCCs or JCC's HR departments. Learn something new every day. How to train on this. How do you help decrease the bias? Obviously, we can't answer all these questions right now, but it's good to know that these questions are here and this desire is here amongst all of you. I want to diversify, but without getting rid of already employed staff. How do I go about doing that without adding positions I can't afford? Deep dives into topics. I wish we had a powerful platform to keep the HR community within JC connected. Well, that's what we want to start to think about and help build. Talent management in pandemic, excellent. A couple of more seconds on this one. I think I have 2 more after this. And again, the chat is there for you too if you didn't have a chance to put it in here. I see 37 out of 65. This is great. This is really just a wonderful way to hear from all of your voices in a very timely and organized way. Excellent. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one. Again, the chat is there in case you have what's been going well at your JCC. Great, excellent. Continued learning. Okay, I think a couple more are coming in. I love this platform. Happy to tell you more about Menti and Spot Me. Okay, next one, because I do want to leave some time for discussion. What's getting in our way of making change? So given what we have now learned from Sara, from our panel, from Amy, from each other, okay, workloads, lack of time, budget, change, money, budget, okay, whether known or not. Right, and I guess some things to think about, whether it's time, budget, how might we be aware of what's getting in our way to find ways to have it not be in our way? That might be a future topic of conversation too. Resistance from other staff, ourselves, stress. We don't like change. Bad habits that have developed. What habits have we developed over the pandemic that are good and that might be difficult as we get out of the pandemic? I think something that Alana Azen was saying yesterday, head of JPRO in the plenary, in the movement moment. Not enough time, not enough money, dealing with the present instead of planning for a future. Resources. I'm saying, whoops, I didn't mean to move it so quickly. Here, you should be back on this one. If you wanted to do what's getting in the way of making change, alignment, senior management, excellent. Excellent in that I'm glad you're answering the question, not necessarily excellent in these things that are barriers, but it's good to be aware of them. Okay, the last question, and then I'll unshare my screen so Joy can lead some discussion. How might we continue connecting and engaging as a community, as an HR peer community? This is guidance not only for Joy and myself and our colleagues, but also guidance for each other. Reach out to other community organizations that are not Jewish. Let's see if we can get a few more answers here before I close the Menti. Monthly sessions on particular topics, HR group meetings, having more check-in sessions for all JCCs, monthly virtual HR meetings, answer those emails on the HR listserv, quarterly info sharing sessions, continue to have these conference powwows, get involved in local events, more connection outside listserv. This is terrific. So I'm going to let this stay open for just another minute. I don't see Joy's face, but I know she and I are like, this is great, because this is what we want to do, is continue to engage with you. Fantastic. And I know I've said this already, but we were going to save all of these answers and reflect on them with you, both certainly after ProCon as well as during. Excellent. A couple more seconds on this question. Oh, okay. I think I ended it. There we go. We go back. All right. All right. I will end it. But again, your chat is there also there too. I will stop sharing. Hopefully I can see everybody. Joy, why don't I pass it back to you and you can open it for discussion.
Thank you, Mark. I'm curious, how many of you have used something like Padlet or Mentimeter to gain information from your staff? Have you heard about this before? You can like raise your hand if you've heard of it. I see a lot of people shaking their heads. No, this is just like a fun way to send something out to your staff to get information. And we can share with you, Mark can send out an email giving us all information about how to get into Mentimeter, how to get into Padlet. There are some things that are available for free, and then there are some that have some kind of like subscription to them. But it is a fun way. We've been doing it a lot at JCC Association. I certainly love the fact that we all want to stay connected, and the email listserv is one way to do it. And I'm hoping that as we progress past ProCon, we'll be able to engage this group more with more peer community sessions and more peer community learning. We'd like to hear from you beyond today, and we'd like you all to stay engaged with each other. It's really important for you to ask those questions, answer the questions that come up in the emails. It only takes a minute, but it's so helpful for us to get information and for you to give information to each other. And I know that there's a number of people on the screen as I'm scrolling through to all 3 pages that I have seen and relied on over the years, so that we can, you know, stay in touch and share information and share questions and challenges. There's lots of people on the screen that I know that I can turn to if I have a question or a challenge or a concern. And I'm hoping that either through our informal ways of connecting here, or even as a formal way of you reaching out to somebody that you see on the screen and be able to say, hey, I liked what you said. Can you explain more? I'm going to give you a call, or I'd like to exchange email addresses with you, something like that. So that's really important stuff. We're hoping that we're going to be able to, not just for HR communities, but the reason that these individual communities are called peer communities, because JCC Association is setting up a system for all 19 of the peer communities, and hopefully even more. Like there were some people that were in IT that didn't have their own peer community. Some administrative people don't have their own peer community. We're building all of that out, and we hope as we continue to build that out through 2021, we're going to be able to open up more of that as well. And so I really think it's important. I see a couple of things, a couple of questions that popped in the chat. Is it all returned anonymously? Mark, do you have an answer for that about Mentimeter? I believe it is all anonymous.
Yes, in fact, I'd have to figure out a way for it to be not anonymous, but all of the submissions from that you just submitted, I have no idea who's submitting what, which makes it a really nice tool, especially when it, you know, we're not looking from specific people. We just want to get a general sense of the crowd. So yes.
Great. And someone also put in the chat that they are seeing questions come through in our HR listserv, but then they don't see the answers. And I would suggest that, you know, when you respond to an answer, don't just respond to the person asking the question, because maybe it's a question that other people have as well. So respond to all, and that way we'll be able to all see what your response is. I would also suggest, like yesterday, there were a couple of people that had ideas on how to change their onboarding, and they had materials that they wanted to share. Let's start sharing all of that. Let's put things up in the chat or in emails, and just like throw it out there. This way, if it's something that you're interested in, if it's something that you have that you think is good, other people will grab a hold of it and be able to experience it the same thing. Let me just see what someone said something about a security peer group. Yes, that's also on the list. I know that security has become more of a thing, and you certainly are all hiring for security staff. So that's definitely something that we have in our lessons. So in the chat, let us know, what was the one thing that you've been able to take away with you from our pre-session, from our session yesterday, from our session today, that you think you're going to move forward with, that you hadn't thought about before, or that was a reminder? Okay, revising our onboarding program, so important. And that's also something that I think we can all share. So as you're working on your onboarding programs, share it out. If it's a new project that you're proud of and you've just started, let's get it out there. And you can also share it and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of putting in my onboarding program. What have you done? Being more intentional with the team about implicit bias. We've learned a lot. It's certainly something that we all need to learn more. And we might not even know that we're doing it when we're reading a resume or we're seeing what school someone went to. So let's keep that in the back of our minds. Vastly improving our onboarding and job descriptions and how they're written. Absolutely. I think Milwaukee had posted before a statement that they're using. You can scroll up through the chat, a statement that they're using in their job announcements so that people are realizing that they can apply for jobs even if you're not Jewish. Onboarding is a big thing. I'm seeing it come in. It's time to hit the reset button on how we do our practices. Absolutely. And get people involved. Get buy-in from your senior managers so that they can be involved as well. Also, how are we taking a look at all the different levels of the spectrum, from our young counselors who like text alerts all the way through to our baby boomers and beyond? And how are they communicating with us, especially while we're still hiring virtually? Checking that all of our requirements listed on the job descriptions are actually required. We heard that yesterday, and that's so important. And including regardless of faith, that kind of language. So, yeah, very, very good. Implicit bias with the management team. I hope we're all starting to have that conversation because it's really, really important. Create a coaching session for staff who do part-time hiring and talk about risk management, the side of that for virtual hiring. We heard yesterday that possibly recording sessions. I would caution us all to make sure we're checking with our attorneys before we're recording sessions, but certainly something to start to think about. More tightly directing the recruiting and interview process. Absolutely. Training new hires at a slower pace. Recrafting and listening skills, experience in hiring. These are all great things. And the wonderful part about a recording on Zoom is that it captures all of these chat information so that we'll be able to pull that out and start to do some training on more of these things. So I see we're coming up on the top of the hour. Mark, do you have some final announcements for us? We have lots more to ProCon to go. So hopefully this isn't the end of the time that you're going to be spending with us.
Yeah, stick with me and Joy for a couple more minutes, just because I want you to hear these announcements and then a final thank you to people in this room. So at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 Pacific, 1:30 Central, 12:30 Mountain, you will have the first opportunity for enrichment electives. Well, I think there's 15 enrichment sessions that you can choose, including, I'm going to highlight 3. One is with Amani Chapman and Franny Silverman. They're going to be talking of how your JCCs can move towards racial equity, which is a nice dovetail on what we just talked about, but it's broader. It's beyond the HR hiring frame. So they're terrific. Becoming our best selves using Jewish mindfulness and midot to relieve stress and build resilience. It's a project we have with J-Response and the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. They're going to do an hour session. Many of our JCCs did a whole 10-week program earlier this year. I see Pamela Andrews, who led the group in Columbus. But if you want 1 hour or send your staff for 1 hour, it's great. And please forgive me. I'm going to highlight the session that I'm teaching in a half an hour. It's called Bless Our Workforce. It's based on a book that I just wrote about how we can best motivate and value our staff based on career narratives that I wrote about, supported by management theory and the wisdom of our Jewish tradition. Will be a lot of fun. So choose any one of those 3 sessions. And if another session is excited for you, go. We just hope you go because there's just so much good stuff. Our colleagues are our best teachers. At 4 o'clock Eastern, join us for the JCC Excellent Showcase. There are 2 sets of 30-minute sessions. Your colleagues, representing many JCCs, will share JCC initiatives in programming, staff recruiting and retention, visionary management, or marketing and media, offering a great opportunity to learn about initiatives that can be replicated in your JCC community. Find more information and links on Spot Me. As Joy mentioned at the beginning, our virtual vendor hall will be open again tomorrow from 1:45 to 2:45 Eastern. If you have a trusted advising session tomorrow, it's going to be during those half-hour blocks in that hour. But if you don't have the trusted advising session, sponsors will be available for live, engaging, and informative video breakouts. I just want one more time thank the folks in this community that helped Joy and myself advise us to create these 3 sessions. So Johanna Fine, Angie Stolitano, Michelle Eisenberg, Tracy Thompson. I think I'm missing a couple, Joy. I apologize. I didn't put it in my notes. And all the others that were on the call with us. And enjoy the rest of ProCon. Joy, any last words?
No, I was just putting in the chat that we have the ability to informally chat with each other later, 5 o'clock Eastern time in J Cafe. It's another fun way. Join us. If you liked Padlet or if you like Mentimeter and you want to learn more about these things, Kumo Space is a new way for us to chat with each other. I'll be in the pool. And I don't know where Mark is assigned, but
I think I'm in the dance studio.
there you go. It's a great way for us to do it. Check it out. There's more information on Spot Me about how to access it through kumospace.com.
Yes.
So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for all the amazing work you do. We are here to support you, support each other. Love you all. Have a great
Hey, HR, and thank you, Joy.
Take care.